Sometimes a man's greatest fortune comes disguised as his simplest job. In 1880's Sagebrush Falls, broke cowpoke Eli Brooks thought he'd hit bottom when he took work mending fences for a quiet ranch girl named Maybelle Hart. What he didn't know was that beneath her worn calico dress and sun-weathered hat, Maybelle secretly owned every bank in 3 counties. Her late father had taught her to hide her wealth like a loaded gun, keep it close, but never let folks see it coming. While Eli mucked stalls and branded cattle, Maybelle was moving money through midnight telegrams, backing homesteaders against drought, and blocking a ruthless railroad baron's land grab. But when that baron sparked a bank run to seize the Hart spread and the whole valley, Maybelle's double life got dragged into the harsh saloon light. Now she'd have to choose between the quiet ranch life she loved and the financial empire she never wanted to reveal. What happens when the most powerful woman in the territory has to trust a down-and-out cowboy with the secret that could destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust cloud had been following Eli Brooks for 3 days when he finally crested the hill overlooking Sagebrush Falls, his mare, a sorrel named Patience, bought for $12, and a broken pocket watch from a desperate gambler in Dodge City wheezed beneath him like an old bellows. The worn leather saddlebags draped across her haunches contained everything Eli owned in this world: a spare shirt with more holes than fabric, a tin cup dented from countless campfires, a dog-eared copy of Marcus Aurelius that his mother had pressed into his hands before consumption took her, and a Colt .45 that hadn't fired true since he'd pawned and reclaimed it twice over the past winter. Below him, Sagebrush Falls sprawled across the valley floor like a woman's Sunday dress laid out to dry. The town had that particular energy of a place growing faster than its breeches new pine lumber gleaming yellow beside weathered gray siding, fresh painted signs competing with sun-faded advertisements, and the constant ring of hammers as carpenters raced to keep up with the influx of fortune-seekers, railroad men, and settlers chasing the promise of cheap land and cheaper dreams. Main Street ran straight as a rifle, barrel from the train depot at the eastern edge to the cluster of saloons and gaming houses that marked the western boundary of respectability. The Northern Pacific's rails gleamed silver in the afternoon sun, testament to the iron horse that had brought prosperity to this corner of Montana territory. Freight wagons groaned under loads of mining equipment bound for the Gold Claims in the hills, while passenger coaches disgorged their human cargo of farmers, merchants, and the occasional well-dressed gentleman whose soft hands suggested business conducted far from the dust and sweat of honest labor. Eli had ridden through a dozen such towns in the past year, each one promising a fresh start that somehow never materialized. There was always work for a man who knew horses and cattle, but it was the kind of work that paid in beans and bacon, barely enough to keep body and soul together, while the real money flowed to men who owned rather than labored. At 32, Eli carried the particular weariness of a man who had once held something valuable and watched it slip through his fingers like sand. The Hart ranch sat apart from the main bustle, a modest spread occupying the gentle slopes northwest of town. From his vantage point, Eli could make out the weathered barn, a simple farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and pastures dotted with grazing cattle that looked well fed despite the dry summer. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady column, suggesting the kind of domestic permanence that felt as foreign to Eli as a church hymn sung in Chinese. He'd heard about the job from a bartender in Miles City, a widow woman named Hart looking for seasonal help, room and board, plus $20 a month for a man who knew his way around livestock. The bartender had mentioned it casual-like, the way information traveled in saloons where desperate men gathered to nurse their wounds with rot-gut whiskey. Nothing fancy, the man had said, just honest work for someone not too proud to mend fences. And muck stalls. Pride, Eli reflected as he guided patients down the winding trail toward the ranch, was a luxury he could no longer afford. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as Eli approached the main house. A woman emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on a flour sack apron. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with the kind of practical beauty that came from honest work under an honest sky. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple braid beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years, and her dress was the faded blue calico that served as uniform for working women across the frontier. But there was something in her bearing, a quiet confidence in the way she moved, that set her apart from the worn-down ranch wives Eli had encountered in his travels. "You'd be the cowhand from Miles City," she said, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. It wasn't a question. "Eli Brooks, ma'am. Come about the work." He touched his hat brim, a gesture his father had drilled into him before the war took the old man away to die in some Virginia field, whose name Eli had tried his best to forget. Maybelle Hart. She studied him with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything from the state of his boots to the way he sat his horse. "You look like you've been riding hard." "Yes, ma'am. Been on the trail since dawn." "Well, get down and we'll see what you're made of." There was no hostility in her words, but no particular warmth either. This was business, her tone suggested, and business required clear terms and honest assessment. Eli dismounted, his legs stiff from long hours in the saddle. Up close, he could see the calluses on Maybell's hands, the sun lines at the corners of her eyes, and the particular way she held herself that spoke of someone who had learned early to rely on her own strength. She moved around patients with the confident stride of someone who knew horses, running practiced hands along the mare's legs and examining her teeth with professional interest. "She's seen better days, but she's sound," Maybell pronounced. "Needs grain and rest more than doctoring." "When did you last have a proper meal?" The question caught Eli off guard. "Yesterday morning, I reckon." "Figured as much. You've got that lean and hungry look that comes from too much pride and too little sense." She started toward the house, speaking over her shoulder. "Come on, then. We'll feed you first. Talk business after. Can't expect a man to make good decisions on an empty stomach." The kitchen was larger than the house's modest exterior suggested, with a cast-iron stove that radiated comfortable warmth and shelves, lined with mason jars full of preserved vegetables and fruits. The table was solid oak, the kind of furniture built to last generations, and the chairs showed the comfortable wear that came from daily use by people who valued substance over style. Maybell moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, ladling stew from a pot that had been simmering on the stove and cutting thick slices from a loaf of bread that filled the room with the honest smell of yeast and flour. She set the meal before Eli without ceremony, then poured herself coffee from a blue enamel pot and settled into the chair across from him. "The work's nothing fancy," she began as Eli ate with the focused attention of genuine hunger. "I run about 200 head of cattle, mostly shorthorns with some longhorn breeding stock. Ranch covers about 800 acres, split between pasture and hay ground. I need someone who can ride fence, brand and doctor cattle, help with the hay harvest, and handle the general maintenance that keeps a place like this running." The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, seasoned with herbs that suggested someone who took pride in cooking as well as ranching. Eli found himself wondering about the woman who had taken a drifter based on nothing more than a bartender's recommendation and feed him like family before even settling the terms of employment. "I can do all that," he said between bites. "Grew up on a cattle ranch in Texas before." He paused, old habits of reticence asserting themselves. Some stories were better left untold, at least until trust had been earned on both sides. "Before, life knocked you sideways," Maybell finished, her tone matter-of-fact rather than sympathetic. "Happens to most of us sooner or later." Question is whether a man learns from it or just gets bitter. I'm not bitter, ma'am. Just careful. Good. Bitter men are trouble. Careful men stay alive. She refilled his coffee cup without being asked. Room and board comes with the job. There's a cabin out behind the barn that's yours for as long as you work here. $20 a month, paid at the end of each month if your work's satisfactory. Sundays are your own, unless there's emergency work with the livestock. The terms were fair, more than fair considering his current circumstances. But something in Maybell's manner suggested there was more to this arrangement than simple employment. She spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions, but there was a watchfulness in her eyes that hinted at deeper currents beneath the surface of this conversation. Sounds reasonable, Eli said. When would you want me to? Dawn? Dawn tomorrow. I'll show you around the place, introduce you to the other hands, and we'll see how you take to the work. She paused, studying him over the rim of her coffee cup. I should mention there might be some complications in the months ahead. There's talk of the railroad expanding their line through this valley, and some of the big interests back east have been sniffing around, making offers on ranch land. Nothing that affects the day-to-day work, but I believe in being straight with folks. Eli nodded, though something in her tone suggested there was more to the railroad situation than she was letting on. In his experience, when powerful interests started making offers on land, the offers had a way of becoming demands, and demands had a way of being enforced by men who settled disputes with something other than legal documents. I appreciate the honesty, ma'am. I've tangled with railroad men before. They don't much care for folks who stand in their way. No, they don't. Maybell's voice carried a note of steel that seemed to come from someplace deeper than her years should have allowed. But this is my land, Mr. Brooks. My father built this ranch from nothing, and he taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds don't look favorable. As evening shadows lengthened across the valley, Eli found himself wondering about the quiet woman who had offered him work and shelter with such straightforward generosity. There was something about Maybelle Hart that didn't quite add up the quality of her furniture. The confidence in her voice when she spoke of fighting railroad interests, the way she moved through the world like someone accustomed to having her wishes respected. But then again, the frontier had always been a place where people could reinvent themselves, where a person's past mattered less than their willingness to work and their ability to stand by their word. If Maybelle Hart had secrets, well, so did most folks who had made their way this far west. What mattered was the work, the honesty of the arrangement, and the chance to build something stable in a world that seemed determined to knock a man down every time he tried to stand up. That night, settled into the simple but comfortable cabin that was to be his home, Eli allowed himself the luxury of hope. The work was honest, the pay was fair, and for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, he had found a place where he might be able to stay long enough to call it home. 3 weeks into his employment at the Hart Ranch, Eli had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The work was demanding, but satisfying, the kind of labor that left a man bone-tired at the end of the day, but with a deep contentment. That came from seeing tangible results. The fence lines were straight and strong, the cattle were thriving on the summer grass, and the hay fields promised a good harvest come autumn. More puzzling to Eli was the growing sense that Maybelle Hart was not quite what she seemed. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on at first, just small inconsistencies that accumulated like dust in the corners of his mind. The way she spoke sometimes, with a vocabulary that seemed broader than most ranch women possessed. The quality of certain items around the house that didn't match the modest exterior she presented to the world. Most telling was the correspondence that arrived with unusual frequency. Letters that she read with intense concentration before burning in the kitchen stove. On this particular morning, Eli was replacing rotted fence posts in the north pasture, when he heard the approach of multiple horses. 3 men rode up the valley toward the ranch house. their bearing and dress marking them as something other than the usual run of cowboys or traveling salesmen. The lead rider sat his horse with military precision, his black suit and silver-headed cane suggesting Eastern money and the kind of authority that expected deference rather than earned it. Eli straightened from his work, his hand instinctively moving toward the hammer at his belt, not as a weapon, but as a tool that might serve as one if necessary. Something about the men's purposeful approach and their studied examination of the ranch property set off warning bells that came from years of experience, reading trouble before it announced itself. The riders dismounted at the main house just as Maybell emerged from the barn. Even at a distance, Eli could see the subtle change in her posture, a stiffening of her spine and a squaring of her shoulders that suggested she knew exactly who these men were and what they wanted. The conversation was too distant for Eli to hear individual words, but the tone carried clearly across the morning air. Formal, uncompromising, an increasingly heated. The man with the cane gestured expansively toward the surrounding land, his movements sharp with impatience. Maybelle stood her ground, her arms crossed and her stance wide, every line of her body radiating defiance. When one of the other men moved toward the barn, as if to inspect it, she stepped smoothly into his path, her voice rising just enough for Eli to catch the sharp edge of command. Abandoning his fence post, Eli started toward the house with the ground-eating stride of a man who had learned to recognize when a situation was about to turn ugly. As he drew closer, fragments of conversation became audible, painting a picture that made his blood run cold. Double quotes. Final survey of the property before we proceed with eminent domain proceedings, the lead man was saying, his voice carrying the polished authority of someone accustomed to having his way. The railroad requires this land for the expanded depot and switching yards. The compensation offered is more than generous. And I've told you, Mr. Thornfield, that my land is not for sale at any price. Maybell replied, her tone level but unyielding. This ranch has been in my family for 20 years, and it will remain so. Marcus Thornfield. Eli had heard the name in saloons from Miles City to Billings, always spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. The man had built his fortune by acquiring land for railroad expansion, using methods that ranged from generous offers to legal maneuvering to tactics that decent people preferred not to discuss in polite company. Miss Hart, Thornfield said, his smile sharp as a blade, I fear you misunderstand the nature of this visit. We're not here to negotiate. We're here to inform you of decisions that have already been made by men with considerably more authority than either of us possesses. The territorial legislature has granted the railroad broad powers of eminent domain. Your preferences in this matter are immaterial. It was then that Eli noticed the wooden stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals along the fence line, each one painted with red markings that could only mean one thing: survey markers. Someone had been on Hart property in the dead of night, mapping out boundaries for seizure. The violation of it, the casual arrogance of marking another person's land like it was already theirs, sent a surge of anger through Eli's chest. Those stakes, Maybell said, her voice deadly quiet, were placed without my permission and without legal authority. I want them removed immediately. Thornfield's laugh was like the sound of ice cracking. My dear woman, you seem to be laboring under the misapprehension that your permission is required for the forward progress of civilization. The railroad serves the greater good, bringing commerce and prosperity to this wilderness. Individual property rights, while quaint, cannot be allowed to impede such vital development. The greater good, Maybell repeated, her tone suggesting. She had encountered such arguments before and found them wanting. Tell me, Mr. Thornfield, how does forcing families from their homes serve the greater good? How does concentrating vast tracts of land in the hands of Eastern investors benefit the people who actually live and work here? The exchange revealed something that surprised Eli. Maybelle was not simply a ranch woman defending her property. She spoke with the sophistication of someone well-versed in legal and political matters. Her arguments precise, and her knowledge of railroad tactics comprehensive. This was not her first encounter with men like Thornfield, and she was clearly prepared for a fight that went far beyond simple property disputes. "Your concerns about social policy are touching," Thornfield said, his patience visibly fraying, "but ultimately irrelevant. The law is the law, Miss Hart, and the law will be enforced. You have 30 days to vacate these premises. Any personal property left behind will be considered abandoned and disposed of accordingly." That was when Eli stepped into the conversation, his presence as sudden and unwelcome as a thunderclap on a clear day. "Seems to me," he said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had faced down his share of bullies, "that the lady has made her position clear. Might be time for you gentlemen to move along." Thornfield's eyes fixed on Eli with the cold assessment of a snake sizing up potential prey. "And you are?" "Eli Brooks. I work here." "Ah, yes, the hired help." Thornfield's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Perhaps you'd like to reconsider your employment situation. Mr. Brooks, working for someone who is about to lose everything to legal proceedings might not be the wisest career choice." The threat was unmistakable, but Eli had heard worse from better men. "I reckon that's my decision to make. Just like it's Miss Hart's decision whether to sell her land." "Actually," Thornfield said, drawing a folded document from his coat, "it's not. This is a preliminary injunction filed with the territorial court, freezing all property transfers and improvements on this land pending eminent domain proceedings. Miss Hart is now legally prohibited from selling, improving, or in any way altering this property. Any violations will result in immediate forfeiture and criminal prosecution." The legal maneuvering was clearly designed to prevent Maybelle from strengthening her position or finding allies who might purchase the land to protect it from seizure. It was the kind of sophisticated legal warfare that required both political connections and considerable financial resources to execute effectively. But instead of the dismay or confusion that Thornfield clearly expected, Maybelle's reaction was something quite different. She studied the document with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was reading, her eyes moving across the legal language with practiced efficiency. When she looked up, there was something in her expression that made Eli think of a chess player who had just realized her opponent had walked into a carefully prepared trap. "This injunction," she said carefully, "was filed in the territorial court in Helena." "Correct." "Under the territorial statute governing railroad development." "Also correct." "The statute that requires demonstration of legitimate public necessity and exhaustion of all reasonable alternatives before eminent domain can be exercised." Thornfield's confident smile flickered slightly. "The legal requirements have been satisfied, I assure you." "I'm sure you believe that." Maybelle folded the document carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. "However, I think you'll find that the situation is considerably more complicated than you've been led to believe. You see, Mr. Thornfield, there are other factors at play here that your railroad friends may not have shared with you." The statement hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, pregnant with implications that neither Eli nor Thornfield could quite grasp. There was something in Maybelle's tone, a quiet confidence that suggested she knew things about this situation that hadn't been shared with anyone else. "What other factors?" Thornfield demanded, his composure beginning to crack. "Why don't you ask your employers? I'm sure they'll be very interested to learn about your visit here today." Maybelle's smile was as enigmatic as her words. "In the meantime, I suggest you remove those survey stakes before someone gets hurt trying to pull them up." The threat was delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment for its full import to register. Thornfield's face darkened with anger, but beneath the bluster, Eli detected something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty. "You're making a very serious mistake, Miss Hart. The railroad has resources and connections that you cannot possibly imagine. Fighting us will accomplish nothing except your own destruction." "Perhaps," Maybell said. "But then again, you might be surprised by the resources available to those who choose their battles carefully." As the three men mounted their horses and rode away, Eli found himself staring at the woman who employed him with new eyes. The confidence she had displayed in the face of Thornfield's threats, the sophisticated understanding of legal procedures, the hints about unknown factors and surprising resources, none of it matched the image of a simple ranch woman scraping by on the frontier. "Miss Hart," he said carefully, "begging your pardon, but that didn't sound like the first time you've dealt with railroad land grabs." "It's not." She was watching the retreating riders with the focused attention of a general studying enemy movements. "My father taught me that there are predators in this world who mistake kindness for weakness and simplicity for ignorance. The wise person lets them continue making that mistake until it's too late for them to correct it." The words carried implications that made Eli's mind race with questions he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. But one thing was becoming clear. Maybelle Hart was involved in something far more complex and dangerous than a simple property dispute. And by choosing to stand with her, Eli had just committed himself to a fight whose true dimensions were only beginning to emerge. The days following Thornfield's visit settled into an uneasy rhythm that reminded Eli of the peculiar quiet that preceded violent storms. On the surface, ranch life continued as before. Cattle needed tending, fences required mending, and the approaching hay harvest demanded preparation. But underneath the routine work, currents of tension flowed like underground rivers, visible only to those who knew how to read the signs. Eli found himself paying closer attention to details that had previously escaped his notice. The frequency of Maybell's correspondence, for instance, which seemed to have doubled since Thornfield's ultimatum. Letters arrived almost daily now, carried by riders who came and went with the purposeful discretion of men conducting serious business. Maybell read each message with intense concentration before consigning it to the kitchen stove, the flames consuming secrets that Eli could only guess at. More puzzling still was the change in Maybell's nighttime routine. She had always been an early riser, but now Eli often saw lamplight burning in the main house well past midnight, the golden glow visible from his cabin window like a beacon in the darkness. Once, unable to sleep, he had walked to the well for water and glimpsed her silhouette through the kitchen window, bent over what appeared to be documents spread across the oak table. The scene had the quality of a woman conducting business of considerable importance, though what kind of business a ranchwoman might have that required such secrecy remained a mystery. The mystery deepened when Jake Morrison, the grizzled cowhand, who had worked the Hart Ranch longer than anyone, made an observation that lodged in Eli's mind like a burr under a saddle blanket. Knowing Miss Maybell since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, Jake said as they worked together replacing boards, "In the barn wall, always been different from other ranch folks, if you take my meaning. Too smart by half," her father used to say, though he meant it as a compliment. "Different how?" Jake paused in his hammering, his weathered face thoughtful. "Hard to put your finger on it exactly. Take her schooling, for instance. Most ranch kids get whatever education the traveling teacher can provide, maybe a few months each year if they're lucky. But old Thomas Hart, he sent that girl back east for proper schooling when she was 14. Boston, I think it was, or maybe Philadelphia. Gone for 3 years, came back talking like she'd swallowed a dictionary and knowing things about business and law that no ranch woman had any call to know." The revelation struck Eli like a physical blow. Eastern education was expensive, prohibitively so for most frontier families. The cost of tuition, room, board, and transportation would have represented years of a working ranch's profits, assuming the ranch turned a profit at all. For a man to make such an investment in his daughter's education suggested either extraordinary prosperity or extraordinary faith in her abilities. That must have cost him plenty, Eli said carefully. You'd think so, wouldn't you? Jake's tone carried an odd note of puzzlement. But funny thing about Thomas Hartman never seemed to worry much about money. Always had what he needed. Always paid his debts on time. Always seemed to know things about market prices and land values that other ranchers didn't. Some folks said he was just lucky. Others figured he had connections back east, maybe family, money that nobody talked about. The conversation planted seeds of curiosity that grew with each passing day. Eli found himself studying Maybell with new eyes, looking for clues to the mystery that seemed to surround her like morning fog. Quality of her clothing, while practical and well-worn, showed signs of superior craftsmanship in the stitching and fabric. Her books, which filled 2 full shelves in the main room, included volumes on law, finance, and politics that would have been at home in a lawyer's office or a banker's study. Most telling of all was the way she moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to having her opinions respected and her decisions carried out. It was subtle, almost unconscious, but unmistakable once Eli learned to recognize it. This was not the bearing of a woman who had spent her life dependent on others' goodwill and tolerance. This was the bearing of someone who had held real power and knew how to use it. The revelation came by accident, as such things often do. Eli was working in the barn's loft, moving hay bales to make room for the coming harvest, when a loose board gave way beneath his feet. As he fell, his reaching hand caught the edge of a wooden crate that had been hidden beneath a tarpaulin in the corner where the roof met the wall. The crate came down with him, its contents spilling across the barn floor in a cascade that made his breath catch in his throat. Telegraph forms, dozens of them, filled out in Maybell's careful handwriting and marked with dates spanning the past several months. Eli gathered them quickly, his eyes automatically scanning the contents as he worked. What he read made no sense within the context of a simple ranch operation. Cattle futures down 2 points, stop recommend shifting grain. Speculation to Chicago board, stop await. Confirmation before proceedings, stop M. Hart. Railroad survey complete. Stop acquiring mineral rights through secondary parties. Stop legal challenges prepared, stop proceed. As discussed, stop M. Hart. Denver Bank reports Thornfield leveraged beyond safety margin, stop vulnerability confirmed. Stop timing critical, stop M. Hart. The messages painted a picture of financial sophistication that staggered Eli's understanding. These were not the communications of a ranchwoman scraping by on cattle sales and hay crops. These were the strategic maneuvers of someone playing a complex game involving commodity speculation, mineral rights, and bank financing. Someone with access to information and capital that dwarfed anything a simple ranch could generate. But it was the last telegram in the pile that stopped Eli's heart entirely. Sagebrush Falls. First National confirms Thornfield note callable on demand, stop 3 county bank consortium. Prepared to coordinate action, stop your authority, absolute stop. Proceed when ready, stop J. Whitmore, president. The implications hit Eli like a physical blow. A bank president addressing Maybell as having absolute authority over a 3-county banking consortium. The casual reference to calling in Thornfield's loans on demand, as if such financial warfare was routine business. The entire structure of the messages suggested not a customer relationship with these banks, but something approaching ownership. Eli's hands shook as he carefully returned the telegrams to their crate and restored the tarpaulin covering. His mind raced through the implications, trying to reconcile the woman who cooked his meals and worried about fence repairs with the financial power suggested by these communications. If Maybelle Hart controlled a banking consortium spanning 3 counties, her wealth would dwarf that of most territorial governors. She would possess the kind of influence that could make or break entire communities, decide the fate of railroad expansions, and shape the economic future of the entire region. The revelation cast every interaction they had shared in a new light. Her confidence in the face of Thornfield's threats, her sophisticated understanding of legal procedures, her casual dismissal of eminent domain proceedings that would terrify most property owners. All of it made sense if she possessed the kind of financial power suggested by the telegrams. But it also raised troubling questions about her motives in hiring him, her reasons for maintaining the charade of a simple ranch woman, and the true nature of the conflict with Thornfield and the railroad interests. If Maybell possessed the resources to crush the railroad's land grab with a simple phone call to her bankers, why was she allowing the situation to escalate? What game was she playing, and where did a down-on-his-luck cowhand fit into her larger strategy? That evening, as they shared their usual dinner in the kitchen, Eli found himself studying Maybell with new eyes. She seemed unchanged, the same practical dress, the same calloused hands, the same matter-of-fact manner that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. But now he noticed other things, the way she held her fork, with the unconscious grace of someone raised with formal table manners, the precise way she spoke, never using a wrong word or unclear phrase, the quality of attention she gave to his stories about his day, as if she were filing away information for future use. "You're quiet tonight," she observed as she poured coffee from the blue enamel pot. "Just thinking about Thornfield's visit," Eli replied, which was true as far as it went. "Wondering what his next move might be." "Men like Thornfield are predictable," Maybell said, her tone carrying the assurance of someone who had dealt with such men before. "They believe that money and connections can overcome any obstacle, and they're often right. But they also tend to underestimate people who don't fit their preconceived notions about power and influence." The words carried layers of meaning that made Eli's pulse quicken. Was she offering him a glimpse behind the mask she wore, or simply speaking from the general wisdom of frontier life? The ambiguity was maddening, but also strangely thrilling. He was beginning to realize that Maybelle Hart was the most fascinating puzzle he had ever encountered, and solving that puzzle might be the most important thing he would ever do. "Miss Hart," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why? Did you hire me? I mean, really, you could have had your pick of experienced hands. What made you choose a drifter with more hard luck than recommendations?" Maybell set down her coffee cup and studied him with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the soft tick of the mantel clock and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods outside. "Because," she said finally, "sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who have nothing left to lose except their integrity. And because I have a feeling that when the time comes to choose sides, you'll choose correctly." The statement hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, full of promise and peril in equal measure. Eli sensed that his answer would determine not just his future at the Hart Ranch, but the very nature of the relationship that was slowly developing between them. "I already have chosen," he said quietly. "I stand with you, whatever comes." Maybell's smile was like sunrise after a long, cold night. "I was hoping you'd say that." The discovery of the telegrams marked a turning point in Eli's understanding of his situation, but it also created a peculiar tension that colored every interaction with Maybell. He found himself caught between his growing feelings for the woman. He saw each day the one who worried about sick calves and took pride in a well-cooked meal, and the mysterious figure of power and influence suggested by those coded messages. The disparity between these two versions of Maybelle Hart created a sense of walking on shifting ground, never quite sure which woman he was addressing at any given moment. The tension came to a head on a sweltering August evening when Eli returned from checking the water holes in the far pastures to find a stranger's horse tied to the hitching post outside the main house. The animal was a magnificent black stallion, worth more than most men earned in a year. Its silver-trimmed saddle and bridle, speaking of wealth that dwarfed anything in Sagebrush Falls. Through the kitchen window, Eli could see Maybell in animated conversation with a well-dressed gentleman, whose bearing suggested both education and authority. Eli unsaddled Patience and settled her in the corral, taking longer than necessary to curry her coat, while he tried to decide whether his employer's business was any concern of his. The decision was made for him when the stranger emerged from the house and mounted his stallion with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. As the man rode past the corral, he touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, revealing a face that belonged in a bank president's office rather than on a working ranch. "Friend of yours?" Eli asked when he entered the kitchen for his evening meal. "Business associate," Maybell replied, her tone suggesting the topic was closed to further discussion. But there was something in her manner, a barely perceptible tension in her shoulders, a slight tightness around her eyes, that suggested the meeting had not gone entirely as planned. Must be important business to bring a man out here on a horse like that. Maybell paused in ladling stew into his bowl, her hand stilling for just a moment before resuming its steady motion. "Some business can't be conducted through letters and telegrams, Mr. Brooks. Sometimes you need to look a person in the eye when you're making certain kinds of arrangements." The careful formality of her address, Mr. Brooks, instead of the more casual use of his first name that had developed over recent weeks, suggested that barriers were being rebuilt even as they spoke. Eli sensed that he was approaching the boundary between what Maybell was willing to share and the secrets she guarded more carefully than gold. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but are those arrangements likely to affect the safety of this ranch and the people who work on it?" A question hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Maybell set down the ladle and turned to face him fully, her pale blue eyes searching his face with the intensity of someone trying to read intentions, written in a foreign language. "That depends," she said finally, "on how well certain people can be trusted to keep confidences and follow instructions, even when they don't understand the full situation." It was both a challenge and an offer, Eli realized. She was testing whether he could accept the limitations she placed on their relationship, while still maintaining his loyalty and effectiveness as an employee. But beneath the professional distance, he sensed something else, a loneliness that came from carrying burdens too, heavy to share and making decisions that affected far more people than anyone realized. "I've never betrayed a confidence in my life," Eli said quietly, "and I've never walked away from a fight when I was needed." "I know." Maybell's voice carried a warmth that contrasted sharply with her formal manner. "That's why you're here." "They." Cryptic response left Eli with more questions than answers. But he had learned enough about Maybell to recognize when a conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Some truths he was beginning to understand had to be earned rather than asked for, and earning Maybell's complete trust would require more than good intentions and hard work. The next morning brought news that cast the previous evening's mysterious meeting in a new light. Jake Morrison arrived at dawn with information gathered during his weekly trip to town, his weathered face grim with the kind of news that made seasoned ranch hands check their weapons and study the horizon for signs of trouble. "Railroad's been busy," Jake announced as they gathered for coffee before beginning the day's work. "Brought in a whole crew of surveyors and engineers, plus a dozen men who don't look like they ever held anything more delicate than a gun handle. Got themselves set up in the old Murphy warehouse, and they've been riding out in groups of 3 and 4, mapping every inch of the valley." The news confirmed what Eli had suspected since Thornfield's visit. The railroad was moving beyond legal, maneuvering into more direct forms of pressure. The presence of armed men suggested they were prepared to enforce their will through intimidation, or worse, if their legal challenges failed to produce the desired results. "Any trouble in town?" Maybell asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Not yet, but folks are nervous. Word is that Thornfield's been meeting with some of the smaller ranchers, making offers that sound generous until you read the fine print. Seems like anyone who doesn't sell voluntary might find themselves facing condemnation proceedings that could take years to sort out in court." The strategy was brutally effective, Eli realized. By forcing property owners into expensive legal battles while simultaneously offering quick cash settlements, Thornfield could acquire the land he needed while appearing to follow proper legal procedures. Most frontier families lacked the resources to fight prolonged court battles, especially when their ability to work their land was frozen pending legal resolution. What about the banks? Maybelle asked, a question seemingly casual, but carrying an undertone that made Eli's pulse quicken. Are they still extending credit to folks who want to fight the railroad? Jake's expression grew troubled. That's the strange part. Some are, some aren't. Sagebrush Falls First National is still backing anyone who wants to hold on to their land. But Miles City Merchants Bank has gotten real careful about extending credit to folks in the path of railroad development. Makes a man wonder who's talking to who behind closed doors. The revelation painted a picture of financial warfare being conducted on multiple fronts simultaneously. If Maybell truly controlled the banking consortium suggested by the telegrams, she was apparently using that influence selectively, supporting resistance in some areas while allowing pressure to build in others. The strategic complexity of such maneuvering suggested a level of sophistication that went far beyond simple property disputes. That afternoon, while working alone in the equipment barn, Eli made another discovery that added another piece to the puzzle of Maybell's true identity. Hidden behind a stack of grain sacks, he found a leather trunk that had been carefully concealed but not locked. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were several dresses of a quality and style that belonged in the finest drawing rooms of Boston or New York, rather than on a working ranch in Montana Territory. The garments were exquisite silk and fine wool in rich colors, with the kind of detailed needlework and perfect tailoring that required both considerable skill and substantial expense. More telling still were the accessories. Kid gloves soft as butter, jewelry that caught the light with the unmistakable gleam of genuine precious stones, and a small leather case containing calling cards engraved with flowing script that read, Miss M. Hart, Boston. The calling card solved one mystery while creating others. If Maybelle maintained a residence and social connections in Boston, her Eastern education had been followed by integration into the kind of society that moved money and influenced policy on a national scale. Such connections would explain her sophisticated understanding of business and law, but they also raised questions about why someone with access to that world would choose to live on a remote ranch in Montana Territory. As Eli carefully returned the items to their hiding place, he reflected on the growing complexity of the woman who employed him. Each revelation seemed to contradict the previous one, creating a portrait of someone who existed simultaneously in multiple worlds while belonging completely to none of them. The simple ranch woman, the mysterious financial power, the Boston society lady, all of these were apparently facets of the same person. But how they fit together remained as puzzling as ever. That evening's dinner conversation took on a different quality, colored by Eli's growing awareness of the multiple layers of Maybell's identity. She spoke casually about ranch business and local news, but he found himself listening for the subtle inflections that suggested deeper currents of thought and planning. When she mentioned her concern about the welfare of neighboring families facing railroad pressure, he heard the voice of someone accustomed to having both the power and the responsibility to help others. When she discussed the practical details of the approaching harvest, he detected the precision of someone who understood that successful operations required attention to seemingly minor details. The Hendersons stopped by while you were checking the water holes, she said as she served apple pie still warm from the oven. They're thinking about accepting Thornfield's offer for their place. Tom's been having chest pains, and Sarah's worried about him handling the stress of a legal fight. The news struck Eli as both personal tragedy and strategic setback. The Henderson Ranch bordered the Hart property on the south, and its loss to railroad control would create additional pressure on Maybell's position. More importantly, Tom and Sarah Henderson were good people who had worked their land for 15 years. building something valuable through honest labor and careful stewardship. What did you tell them? That the decision had to be theirs to make. Maybell's voice carried the weight of someone who understood that leadership sometimes required accepting outcomes you couldn't control. But I also told them that if they decided to fight, they wouldn't be fighting alone. The promise carried implications that made Eli's chest tighten with anticipation and concern. If Maybelle was prepared to openly support the Hendersons against railroad pressure, she would be revealing at least some of her true capabilities. Such exposure would mark the end of her carefully maintained anonymity and the beginning of a more direct conflict with Thornfield and his supporters. That's a generous offer, Eli said carefully, but it might also paint a target on your back. Maybell's smile was sad but determined. The target's already there, Eli. It has been since the day my father taught me that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. The only question now is whether I can help enough people to make the fight worthwhile. The use of his first name, spoken with quiet intimacy, felt like a gift after the formal distance of recent days. But it also carried the weight of trust being offered and responsibility being shared. Eli sensed that he was being invited into Maybell's confidence, not as an employee, but as a partner in whatever was coming. "Count me in," he said simply. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it." "I was hoping you'd say that." Maybelle reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, the contact electric with possibility and promise. "Because I have a feeling things are about to get very interesting indeed." The confrontation Eli had been expecting came 3 days later, but not in the form he had anticipated. Instead of Thornfield's return with more legal documents or hired guns, the challenge arrived in the person of a young woman who rode up to the ranch house on a spotted pony as if she owned the entire territory. She couldn't have been more than 20, with auburn hair braided down her back and the kind of confident bearing that suggested she had never encountered a situation she couldn't handle through sheer force of personality. "You'd be Eli Brooks," she announced as he emerged from the barn, her tone suggesting she had already formed definite opinions about his character and capabilities. "I'm Annie Caldwell, and I need to talk to you about Miss Hart." The name was familiar from conversations in town. The Caldwells ran the largest general store in Sagebrush Falls and were generally regarded as solid, honest folks who minded their own business and expected others to do the same. But something in Annie's manner suggested this was not a social call or routine ranch business. "Miss Hart's in the house," Eli replied, gesturing toward the kitchen where Maybelle was preparing the noon meal. "I'm sure she'd be happy to—" "I don't want to talk to Miss Hart," Annie interrupted, her green eyes flashing with impatience. "I want to talk to you about Miss Hart. There's a difference, and if you're half as smart as people say you are, you'll understand why." The cryptic statement intrigued Eli enough to accept Annie's invitation to walk down to the creek that bordered the property, far enough from the house to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard. As they walked, Annie studied him with the frank assessment of someone sizing up a potential ally or enemy, her evaluation as thorough as a horse trader examining breeding stock. "My father's been doing business in this territory for 20 years, Annie began without preamble, "and he's never seen anything like what's happening with the Hart Ranch situation. You know what I'm talking about?" "Railroad trouble," Eli replied cautiously, unsure how much he should reveal about his growing understanding of the situation's complexity. "Railroad trouble, my foot." Annie's snort of derision carried the authority of someone who had grown up listening to adult conversations about serious business. "This isn't about railroad expansion, Mr. Brooks. This is about power and money on a scale that most folks around here can't even imagine. And Miss Hart is right in the middle of it." The assertion confirmed Eli's suspicions while raising new questions about how much the local community understood about Maybell's true position. If Annie Caldwell, the daughter of a shopkeeper, had pieced together the larger picture, how many others had reached similar conclusions? What makes you think it's more than railroad business? Annie pulled a folded newspaper from her coat pocket, the pages showing the wear of careful reading and consideration. This came in on yesterday's stage from Helena. Look at the financial section. The newspaper was the Helena Independent, and the article Annie indicated was buried on the third page among reports of mining claims and cattle prices. But the headline made Eli's blood run cold. Territorial Banking Consortium challenges railroad land acquisition procedures. The article detailed a complex legal challenge filed by a group of banks spanning 3 counties, alleging that the railroads' eminent domain claims violated territorial law by failing to demonstrate legitimate public necessity. More disturbing still was the article's mention of coordinated financial pressure being applied to force railroad compliance with proper legal procedures. Keep reading, Annie urged, her voice tight with excitement and concern. The final paragraph of the article contained information that made Eli's hands shake. Sources close to the banking consortium suggest that the challenge is being coordinated by a previously unknown financial interest with substantial holdings throughout the region. Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford has reportedly requested a full investigation into the sources of this opposition, citing concerns about outside interference in legitimate development projects. Outside interference, Eli repeated, his mind racing through the implications. If territorial authorities were investigating the banking consortium's activities, Maybell's carefully maintained anonymity might not protect her much longer. My father thinks Miss Hart is connected to this banking business somehow, Annie said, watching Eli's face for confirmation of her suspicions. He's been tracking the patterns of credit and financing in the valley, and there are things that don't add up unless someone with serious money is pulling strings behind the scenes. The revelation that Samuel Caldwell was sophisticated enough to recognize financial manipulation suggested that Maybell's secret might not be as well kept as she believed. If a small-town merchant could piece together the evidence, how long before Thornfield and his associates reached similar conclusions? What does your father want me to do about it? He wants you to convince Miss Hart to be careful, Annie replied, her young face grave with concern. There are rumors that Thornfield has hired investigators from back east, men who specialize in finding things that people want to keep hidden. If Miss Hart is involved in something that could bring territorial authorities down on this valley, a lot of innocent people could get hurt. The warning carried implications that made Eli's chest tighten with protective instincts he was only beginning to acknowledge. His feelings for Maybelle had evolved beyond simple attraction into something deeper and more complex, a combination of respect, admiration, and growing love that made the thought of her in danger almost unbearable. I'll talk to her, he promised, though he suspected that Maybelle was far more aware of the risks than anyone realized. Annie nodded, apparently satisfied that her message had been delivered effectively. But as they started back toward the house, she paused and turned to face him with the serious expression of someone about to share information. That could change everything. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. Yesterday, a man came through town asking questions about Miss Hart and her family history. He was well-dressed, spoke like an educated man, but there was something about him that made my skin crawl. He was particularly interested in any records of financial transactions, property transfers, anything that might show how the Hart family came by their money. The news struck Eli like a physical blow. If professional investigators were already asking questions about Maybelle's background, the careful secrecy that had protected her identity was beginning to unravel. The discovery of her true role in the banking consortium would not only expose her to legal challenges, but could also put her in physical danger from men who had too much invested in the railroad project to accept defeat gracefully. Did this man give a name? Called himself Charles Morrison, said he was representing Eastern investment interests concerned about irregularities in territorial banking practices. But my father didn't believe him, said the man had the look of someone who settled disputes with methods that didn't involve courtrooms. The description sent ice through Eli's veins. If Thornfield had moved beyond legal maneuvering to hiring the kind of men who solved problems through intimidation and violence, the situation had escalated beyond anything a simple ranch hand could handle through honest work and loyal service. As they approached the house, Eli found himself studying the familiar buildings and landscape with new eyes, seeing not just the ranch where he had found employment and purpose, but a potential battleground where the woman he was coming to love might have to defend herself against enemies who played by no rules except expediency and greed. That evening, as he shared dinner with Maybell in the warm intimacy of the kitchen, Eli struggled with how to broach the subject of Annie's warning without revealing how much he had guessed about her secret activities. The careful balance of their relationship, built on mutual respect and growing affection despite the barriers she maintained around certain aspects of her life, made direct confrontation impossible. "Had a visitor today," he said, finally choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. Annie Caldwell stopped by with some interesting news from town. Maybell's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a slight stiffening of her posture, a momentary pause in cutting her meat, the kind of heightened attention that suggested she was prepared to hear information that might require immediate action. "What kind of news?" "Seems there's been a stranger asking questions about local families and their business affairs. Annie's father thought you should know in case this fellow comes around here." The euphemistic description allowed Maybell to understand the threat, without forcing either of them to acknowledge the secrets that lay beneath their careful conversation. It was a delicate dance of communication that preserved the boundaries she had established while still conveying essential information. "I appreciate Samuel Caldwell's concern," Maybell replied, her tone carefully neutral. "Did Annie mention what kind of questions this stranger was asking?" "Financial matters, mostly. Property records, banking relationships, anything that might explain how local families have prospered despite the general economic pressures." Maybell nodded thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes distant with calculation. Such curiosity suggests that some people are beginning to look beyond surface appearances. That could complicate certain situations that are already delicate. The coded language confirmed what Eli had suspected. Maybell was fully aware of the risks she faced and had probably been expecting this development. But it also suggested that she had contingency plans for dealing with discovery, plans that might require more than the passive resistance she had employed so far. "Is there anything I should be watching for? Any particular kind of trouble you'd want me to prepare for?" Maybell's smile was both grateful and sad, as if she appreciated his offer while regretting the necessity that prompted it. "Just keep doing what you've been doing, Eli. Be alert, be careful, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, don't ignore that feeling." The advice was sound but frustratingly vague, leaving Eli with the sense that he was preparing for a battle whose nature and timing remained completely unknown. But it also represented another step in the evolution of their relationship from employer and employee towards something approaching partnership, albeit a partnership where one member held most of the cards and made most of the decisions. As the evening shadows lengthened across the valley, Eli found himself wondering how much longer their careful dance of partial truths and unspoken understandings could continue. Forces beyond their control were already in motion, and the collision between Maybell's hidden world and the harsh realities of frontier politics seemed inevitable. When that collision came, as it surely must, Eli suspected that everything they had built together would be tested in ways that neither of them was entirely prepared to face. The collision between worlds came sooner than Eli had expected, arriving with the sunrise on a crisp September morning that should have been devoted to the simple pleasure of bringing in the hay harvest. Instead, he woke to find Maybell already dressed and standing at his cabin door, her face pale with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested decisions had been made during the dark hours while he slept. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, her voice carrying none of the careful formality that had characterized their recent conversations. About everything. About who I really am and why you're really here. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire, pregnant with implications that would change everything between them. Eli dressed quickly and followed her to the main house, where coffee was already brewing and the kitchen table was spread with documents that looked far too official and complex for routine ranch business. "My name is Maybelle Hart," she began as they settled into chairs across from each other. "But that's only part of the truth. I am also the majority owner of the Three Counties Banking Consortium, a financial network that controls credit and investment across more than 50,000 square miles of Montana territory." The confirmation of what Eli had suspected still struck him with the force of physical impact. Hearing the truth spoken aloud, seeing the confidence with which Maybell claimed ownership of vast financial resources, made the scope of her deception both more understandable and more overwhelming. "My father, Thomas Hart, built this empire through 30 years of careful investment and strategic positioning. He understood that the real power on the frontier belonged not to the men with the biggest guns or the most cattle, but to those who controlled the flow of money that made everything else possible." She reached into the leather portfolio that lay open beside her coffee cup and withdrew a small object that caught the lamplight with the warm gleam of precious metal. It was a pocket watch, beautifully crafted and obviously expensive, with an inscription on the back that read, "For Maybelle May, you use power wisely and wear it lightly. Your loving father, T.H." "This was his gift to me on my 21st birthday," Maybell continued, her voice soft with memory and loss. "Along with it came the responsibility for everything he had built, and the promise I made to use that power to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." The watch represented more than expensive jewelry, Eli realized. It was a symbol of inheritance and obligation, a tangible reminder of the burden that came with the kind of wealth and influence most people could barely imagine. The weight of the burden that came with the burden that came with the kind of wealth and influence most people could barely imagine. The weight, a tangible reminder of the burden that came with the burden that came with the kind of wealth and influence most people could barely imagine. Such responsibility would be crushing for someone unprepared for it, but Maybell wore it with the unconscious grace of someone who had been trained from childhood to bear such loads. "For 5 years, I've used the banking consortium to quietly support homesteaders, block unfair land grabs, and ensure that prosperity in this territory benefits the people who actually live and work here, rather than just the Eastern investors, who see it as another source of profit." The explanation cast Maybell's recent activities in an entirely new light. Her midnight correspondence, her mysterious meetings, her confident handling of Thornfield's threats, all of it made sense within the context of someone managing a complex financial empire while maintaining the fiction of being a simple ranch woman. "But secrecy has a price," she continued, her pale blue eyes meeting his with unflinching honesty. "The more I've had to hide my true role, the more isolated I've become. The more carefully I've had to guard my secrets, the harder it's been to trust anyone with the truth." The admission carried an undertone of loneliness that made Eli's chest tighten with protective instincts and growing understanding. The burden of hidden power was not just financial and political, but deeply personal, creating barriers between Maybell and everyone around her that made genuine intimacy almost impossible. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the situation has changed in ways that make continued secrecy impossible," Maybell replied, reaching for another document from the portfolio. "Yesterday, I received this telegram from my contacts in Helena. The message was brief but chilling. Territorial investigation formally. Authorized stop Thornfield, alleging financial conspiracy stop. Expect federal investigators within week stop. Recommend immediate disclosure or departure stop Whitmore." The implications were staggering. If federal investigators were coming to examine the banking consortium's activities, Maybell's carefully constructed anonymity would crumble within days. More troubling still was the suggestion that Thornfield had moved beyond simple property disputes to alleging criminal conspiracy, charges that could result in federal prosecution and the complete destruction of everything Thomas Hart had built. Thornfield has been more clever than I gave him credit for, Maybelle admitted, her voice tight with frustration and grudging respect for her opponent's abilities. While I was focusing on the legal and financial aspects of his land grab, he was building a case that my opposition constitutes illegal interference with interstate commerce. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, Eli realized. By framing the banking consortium's activities as criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate business competition, Thornfield could invoke federal authority that would override territorial jurisdiction and local sympathies. What are your options? I can flee, Maybelle said, her tone suggesting she had already considered and rejected that possibility. Take what portable assets I can gather and disappear into Canada or Mexico before the investigators arrive. Or I can stay and fight, which means revealing everything about my role in the banking consortium and accepting whatever legal consequences follow. The choice she described was between preserving her freedom and protecting the people who had depended on her support. For someone raised with Thomas Hart's values about responsibility and stewardship, it was hardly a choice at all. There's a third option, Eli said quietly, his mind racing through possibilities that might preserve both Maybell's safety and her ability to continue protecting the community. You could trust me to help you find a way to fight that doesn't require sacrificing everything your father built. Maybell's smile was both grateful and skeptical. Eli, I appreciate your loyalty more than you know, but this isn't a problem that can be solved with hard work and good intentions. I'm facing federal investigators, territorial politicians, and railroad lawyers who have resources that dwarf anything a ranch hand can bring to bear. Maybe, Eli replied, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised even him. But you're forgetting something important about hired help. We get around. We listen to conversations that people think don't matter. And we sometimes know things that the important folks overlook. The statement was deliberately vague, but it carried implications that made Maybelle lean forward with sudden interest. There was something in Eli's manner, a quiet certainty that suggested he possessed information or capabilities that might be relevant to their situation. What kind of things? Things like the fact that Marcus Thornfield has been financing his land acquisition efforts with borrowed money secured by fraudulent property valuations. Things like the identity of the federal investigators who will be coming to examine your records. Things like the pressure points that might be used to convince certain territorial politicians that supporting Thornfield's agenda could be bad for their own health and prosperity. Each revelation struck Maybelle like a physical blow, her eyes widening with the realization that the man she had hired as a simple ranch hand possessed knowledge and connections that went far beyond anything his story had suggested. Who are you really, Eli Brooks? The question had been inevitable, but it still caught Eli unprepared for the emotional impact of finally sharing truths he had kept buried for more than a year. I'm exactly who I said I was, a cowhand who needed work and found it here. But I'm also a former federal marshal who spent 10 years investigating financial crimes and political corruption across 3 territories. The revelation transformed everything about their relationship in an instant. Suddenly, Eli's sophisticated understanding of legal procedures, his ability to read the deeper currents in Thornfield's maneuvering, his instinctive grasp of the political implications of Maybell's situation, all of it made perfect sense. Why didn't you tell me? For the same reason you didn't tell me about the banking consortium, Eli replied honestly. Because some truths are too dangerous to share until you know they'll be received by someone who can be trusted with them. Maybelle nodded slowly, her mind clearly racing through the implications of this new information. If you were a federal marshal, you must have contacts in the territorial government. People who owe you favors or respect your judgment. Some, Eli admitted, though using those contacts would mean revealing my own identity and accepting whatever. Consequences come from that disclosure. The parallel between their situations was unmistakable. Both of them had been living under assumed identities, hiding their true capabilities and connections while building new lives, based on partial truths and careful omissions. Now, circumstances were forcing them to choose between continued secrecy and the kind of partnership that could only exist between equals who trusted each other completely. So we both have secrets that could destroy us if they're revealed to the wrong people, Maybelle observed, her voice carrying a note of ironic humor. And we both have resources that could help the other, but only if we're willing to risk everything we've built by trusting someone else with the truth. That's about the size of it. Maybelle stood and moved to the window, staring out at the valley that had become the center of a conflict much larger than either of them could handle alone. When she turned back to face him, her expression carried the resolved determination of someone who had weighed all options and chosen the most dangerous path because it was also the only honorable one. All right, Eli Brooks, or whoever you really are. If we're going to do this, we do it together and we do it right. No more secrets between us, no more partial truths, and no more pretending that we can handle this situation without trusting each other completely. She extended her hand across the table, not in the formal gesture of an employer acknowledging an employee, but in the firm clasp of a partner accepting an equal. As Eli took her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that came from years of hidden responsibility, he realized that everything they had built together was about to be tested in ways that would either destroy them both or forge them into something stronger than either could be alone. The full scope of Thornfield's deception revealed itself 3 days later when Eli's former colleague, Deputy Marshal Tom Whitaker, arrived unannounced with a saddlebag full of documents that would change everything they thought they understood about their enemy. Tom was a weathered man in his 50s who had spent 20 years following paper trails through the labyrinth of territorial politics and financial corruption, and the grim satisfaction on his face suggested he had uncovered something significant. Eli Brooks, Tom said as he dismounted in the ranch yard. Or should I say Deputy Marshal Elijah Brooks, currently on unofficial leave following the unfortunate business in Silver Creek. The formal introduction served notice that Tom was here in his official capacity, which meant that whatever information he carried had the weight of federal authority behind it. Maybelle emerged from the house at the sound of voices, her bearing alert and cautious as she assessed this new development. Tom Whitaker, meet Maybelle Hart, Eli said, making the introductions with careful formality. Tom's an old friend who specializes in finding things that people prefer to keep hidden. Miss Hart. Tom touched his hat brim with the courtesy of a man who had learned to respect women who survived and prospered on the frontier. I've been hearing interesting things about your situation with the railroad. Thought you both might like to know what I've discovered about Marcus Thornfield and his associates. They gathered in the kitchen where Tom spread his documents across the oak table with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. The papers included bank records, property transfers, correspondence between territorial officials, and financial statements that painted a picture of corruption so vast and systematic that it took Eli's breath away. Marcus Thornfield, Tom began, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered dangerous prey, is not actually employed by the Northern Pacific Railroad. He represents a consortium of Eastern investors who have been using railroad expansion as cover for the largest land grab in territorial history. The revelation struck both Eli and Maybelle like physical blows. If Thornfield wasn't working for the railroad, then the legal authority he claimed for his eminent domain proceedings was completely fabricated. Keep going, Maybelle said, her voice tight with controlled fury. The consortium includes 3 sitting territorial legislators, 2 federal judges, and the Territorial Banking Commissioner, all of whom have been purchasing land through shell companies at a fraction of its actual value, been selling it to the railroad at enormous profits. The whole operation is designed to concentrate vast tracts of Montana territory in the hands of a small group of Eastern investors who have no intention of developing it for the public good. Tom pulled out a map marked with colored pins showing the scope of the land acquisition scheme. The pattern was staggering. Virtually every valuable piece of property in 3 counties was targeted for seizure through fraudulent legal proceedings. But here's where it gets interesting for you folks specifically. Tom continued, producing a set of forged bank transfer orders that made Maybell gasp with recognition. Thornfield has been creating fake financial records showing that the 3 counties banking consortium has been engaged in illegal manipulation of territorial finances. These documents are what he's planning to present to the federal investigators as evidence of criminal conspiracy. The forged documents were masterful in their detail and apparent authenticity. They showed fictional transactions totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, all designed to make it appear that Maybell had been using her banking network to manipulate territorial politics for personal gain. If accepted as genuine, they would result not only in criminal prosecution, but in the complete destruction of everything Thomas Hart had built. How did you get these? Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. From the same source. That's been feeding me information about territorial corruption for the past 6 months, Tom replied, his expression grim with the weight of unpleasant truths. Someone inside Thornfield's organization who finally got tired of watching innocent people destroyed for the sake of Eastern profits. The existence of an informant within Thornfield's inner circle opened possibilities that neither Eli nor Maybell had considered. If they could identify and coordinate with this person, they might be able to stay ahead of Thornfield's schemes, and perhaps even turn his own methods against him. There's more, Tom said, producing a final document that made Eli's blood run cold. Thornfield's investigation into your background, Eli, has turned up some interesting connections. Specifically, your involvement in the Silver Creek incident and the reasons why you left federal service. The mention of Silver Creek brought back memories that Eli had spent more than a year trying to forget. The botched investigation, the deaths of innocent people, the political pressure that had forced him to choose between his badge and his conscience. It was the darkest chapter of his life, and the thought of it being used as a weapon against Maybell made his hands shake with suppressed rage. What does Silver Creek have to do with our situation here? Maybell asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the obvious concern in her eyes. Everything, Tom replied, his tone heavy with regret. Because the Territorial Banking Commissioner who was killed in Silver Creek, the man whose death ended Eli's career in federal service, was Thomas Hart. The revelation hit the kitchen like a thunderbolt, leaving all 3 of them staring at each other in stunned silence. The implications cascaded through Eli's mind like an avalanche. Maybell's father had been murdered as part of the same corruption scheme that now threatened her, and Eli had been the federal marshal charged with investigating his death. You knew my father? Maybell's voice was barely a whisper, her face pale with shock and dawning understanding. I was investigating his murder when I was forced off the case, Eli admitted, the words feeling like broken glass in his throat. He had uncovered evidence of the territorial land grab scheme and was preparing to expose it when he was killed. The official report called it a robbery gone wrong, but I knew better. The political pressure to close the case without pursuing the truth was what finally convinced me to turn in my badge. Maybell stared at him with eyes that seemed to see everything: his pain, his guilt, his reasons for keeping this connection hidden, even after learning her true identity. You've been carrying this burden for more than a year, knowing that my father's killers were still free, knowing that the corruption he died fighting was still spreading. "I tried to find another way to get justice for him," Eli said quietly, "but I was just one man against a system designed to protect the guilty and silence the truthful. When I heard about the job here, I thought maybe I could at least protect his daughter from sharing his fate." The admission transformed their entire relationship in an instant. Eli's presence at the Hart Ranch was not the simple coincidence it had seemed, but the deliberate action of a man seeking redemption for his failure to protect someone he had respected and admired. "So Thornfield knows about the connection between you and Thomas Hart," Tom observed, studying the emotional dynamics playing out before him with professional interest. "Which means he'll use it to discredit both of you when the federal investigators arrive." "Unless we move first," Maybelle said, her voice carrying a note of steel that reminded Eli of her father's reputation for moral courage under pressure. "Tom, what would you need to build a case against Thornfield and his associates?" "Evidence that the forged documents are fabrications, testimony from credible witnesses about the true nature of the land grab scheme, and proof that territorial officials had been compromised by Eastern money." Tom's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for this question. "All of which I happen to have, thanks to our friend inside Thornfield's organization." The possibility of turning the tables on their enemies sent a surge of hope through Eli's chest, followed immediately by awareness of the enormous risks involved. Taking on a conspiracy that included territorial legislators and federal judges would require not just courage, but careful planning and flawless execution. "What's the timeline?" Eli asked. "Federal investigators arrive in 5 days," Tom replied, "which gives us enough time to present our evidence if we move quickly and don't make any mistakes." Maybelle stood and moved to the window, staring out at the valley that had become the center of a conflict much larger than any of them had originally understood. When she turned back, her expression carried the resolved determination of someone who had decided to risk everything for the chance at justice. "My father spent 30 years building something he believed would make life better for the people of this territory. He died because he refused to let corrupt men destroy that dream for their own profit." Her voice carried the authority of someone speaking from deep conviction. "I'll be damned if I'm going to let them succeed now." The declaration marked the end of secrecy and the beginning of open warfare against enemies who had revealed themselves to be far more dangerous and far-reaching than anyone had suspected. As the three of them began planning their counterattack, Eli felt the weight of more than a year's guilt and frustration beginning to lift from his shoulders. Thomas Hart would finally get the justice he deserved, and his daughter would have the chance to complete the work he had died protecting. But beneath the satisfaction of finally taking action against their enemies, Eli remained acutely aware of the personal stakes involved. The woman he had come to love was about to risk everything she had inherited from her father, and their own relationship would be tested in ways that could either forge them into true partners or destroy them both in the attempt to honor the dead and protect the innocent. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity that transformed the Hart Ranch from a quiet cattle operation into the headquarters of what Tom Whitaker grimly described as the most important federal case in territorial history. Messages flew between the ranch and contacts across 3 counties as Maybell activated a network of allies that had been years in the building, while Eli found himself drawing on skills and connections he had thought were permanently buried with his federal badge. The strategy they developed was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its requirements. Rather than simply defending against Thornfield's accusations, they would present federal investigators with evidence of a corruption scheme so vast and well documented that it would shift the entire focus of the investigation from Maybell's banking activities to the criminal conspiracy that had been operating under federal authority. "The key is timing," Tom explained as they huddled over maps and documents in the kitchen that had become their war room. "We need to present our evidence in a way that forces the investigators to choose between pursuing Thornfield's fabricated case against Miss Hart and exposing the real criminals who have been manipulating territorial law for their own profit. The challenge lay in the political sensitivity of their accusations, charging sitting territorial legislators and federal judges with criminal conspiracy required not just evidence, but the kind of ironclad documentation that would survive the inevitable. Counterattacks from men with vast resources and powerful connections. Maybell's transformation during these preparations astonished Eli with its completeness. The quiet ranch woman who had hired him to mend fences revealed herself to be a strategic thinker of remarkable sophistication, capable of coordinating complex financial maneuvers while maintaining operational security that would have impressed military intelligence officers. She moved between her roles as grieving daughter-seeking justice and calculating businesswoman, protecting her interests with a fluidity that spoke of years spent balancing competing demands and hidden agendas. The banking consortium records will prove that every transaction Thornfield claims was illegal was actually designed to prevent exactly the kind of corruption he represents. She explained as she organized documents that would serve as evidence. My father built safeguards into the system specifically to prevent outside interests from manipulating territorial finances. The record she produced painted a picture of Thomas Hart as a man who had anticipated the exact kind of scheme that Thornfield represented. His careful documentation of every transaction, his insistence on transparency in all consortium activities, his creation of oversight mechanisms that prevented any single entity from exercising unilateral control, all of it demonstrated a level of foresight that made his murder even more tragic and significant. But the most crucial element of their strategy depended on information that could only come from Tom's mysterious informant within Thornfield's organization. Without inside knowledge of the specific charges that would be presented to federal investigators, they would be fighting blind against enemies who had been planning this attack for months. The informant's identity was revealed on the third day of preparation when Annie Caldwell arrived at the ranch driving a wagon loaded with supplies and carrying a leather satchel that contained the most damning evidence yet assembled against the corruption conspiracy. Miss Caldwell has been our inside source for the past 6 months, Tom explained as Annie spread her documents across the kitchen table with the professional competence of someone who had been conducting intelligence operations for far longer than her age suggested possible. My father's general store has been the unofficial bank for half the small ranchers in the valley, Annie explained, her young face grim with the weight of secrets that could destroy powerful men. When Thornfield's people started offering to buy information about local families' financial situations, we realized they were building dossiers on everyone who might oppose their land grab. The satchel contained copies of correspondence between Thornfield and his Eastern associates, financial records showing the flow of money through shell companies and corrupted officials, and most damning of all, the original documents from which the forged banking records had been created. They needed legitimate transaction records from the banking consortium to create convincing forgeries, Annie continued. So they approached my father about selling copies of deposit and transfer records from consortium member banks. What they didn't know was that he immediately contacted Miss Hart about their approach. The revelation meant that Maybell had been aware of Thornfield's investigation for months, allowing her to prepare for exactly the kind of attack that was now materializing. But it also raised questions about why she had allowed Eli to remain ignorant of the true situation until circumstances forced full disclosure. I couldn't tell you about Annie's intelligence work, Maybell said, reading the questions in Eli's eyes, because I didn't know whether Thornfield's people had approached you as well, until I was certain of your loyalty and your reasons for being here. Any additional information would have put both you and Annie at risk. The explanation made sense from a security standpoint, but it also highlighted the complexity of the trust issues that had shaped their relationship from the beginning. Both of them had been operating with incomplete information while making decisions that affected not just their own safety, but the welfare of everyone connected to their hidden war against corruption and greed As the day of the federal investigators' arrival approached, Eli found himself taking on a role he had never expected to play. Again, federal law enforcement officer acting in an official capacity. Tom had arranged for his temporary reinstatement as a deputy marshal, giving him the authority to present evidence and make arrests if the situation warranted such extreme measures. "The badge feels heavier than I remembered," Eli admitted as he pinned the star to his vest and checked the load in his Colt revolver. The weapon had been professionally cleaned and repaired during his time at the Hart Ranch, its action smooth and reliable in a way it hadn't been since before his troubles began. "Weight of responsibility," Tom observed. "Though I suspect you've been carrying that burden, whether you wore the badge or not." The observation was accurate in ways that made Eli uncomfortable with its implications. His year of exile from federal service had been motivated by the conviction that some duties transcended official authority, and that real justice sometimes required acting outside the boundaries of law and procedure. Now, wearing the badge again, he felt the full weight of representing not just his own desire for vindication, but the hopes of everyone who had suffered under the corrupt system they were about to challenge. The final element of their preparation involved securing the Hart Ranch against the possibility that Thornfield might resort to violence rather than accept legal defeat. Eli's experience with frontier conflicts suggested that men with as much to lose as Thornfield's associates would not hesitate to eliminate witnesses who threatened their freedom and prosperity. "We're dealing with people who have already committed murder to protect their interests," Eli warned as they discussed security arrangements. "Thomas Hart's death proves they're willing to kill anyone who gets too close to exposing their operations." The reminder cast a shadow over their preparations that no amount of legal strategy could dispel. They were not just challenging corrupt officials in a courtroom. They were placing themselves in direct opposition to people who had demonstrated their willingness to use any means necessary to protect their criminal enterprise. Maybell's response to this reality revealed another facet of her character that Eli had only glimpsed before. She moved through the ranch house, gathering items that spoke of preparation for siege. A Winchester rifle that showed signs of regular maintenance, ammunition that suggested she had been expecting trouble for some time, and most telling of all, a detailed map showing every approach to the ranch property marked with defensive positions and escape routes. "My father taught me that power creates enemies," she explained, as she showed Eli the defensive preparations that had been made long before his arrival. "He also taught me that the price of protecting good people sometimes includes being prepared to fight bad ones." A map revealed that the Hart Ranch had been designed as much for defense as for cattle operations. The placement of buildings created natural choke points that would funnel attackers into killing zones, while the carefully maintained network of irrigation ditches provided covered movement for defenders. Most significantly, the ranch house itself was built like a frontier fort, with thick walls, small windows, and sight lines that covered all approaches as evening shadows lengthened across the valley on the night before the federal investigators' arrival. Eli found himself standing watch on the ranch house porch with the familiar weight of responsibility and anticipation that had once defined his professional life. The peaceful sounds of cattle settling for the night and wind sighing through the cottonwoods created an almost dreamlike contrast to the violence and confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. Maybell joined him on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee and moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with whatever the morning might bring. The warm intimacy of sharing coffee in the gathering darkness felt like stolen time, a brief respite from the pressures and dangers that would soon test everything they had built together. "Do you think we'll win?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that victory might come at a cost that made triumph feel like defeat. "We'll expose the truth," Eli replied carefully. "Whether that constitutes winning depends on how you measure success." The answer reflected his own struggle with the moral complexities of their situation. Justice for Thomas Hart would require destroying the careers and freedom of men who wielded considerable power and influence. Success in their legal battle would inevitably create new enemies and new dangers for everyone connected to their cause. My father always said that some fights are worth having regardless of the outcome. Maybelle said, her tone carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had found meaning in principle rather than pragmatism. He believed that standing up to corruption and greed was a moral obligation that transcended personal safety or convenience. The philosophy that had guided Thomas Hart's life and ultimately led to his death now shaped his daughter's approach to the conflict they faced. It was a perspective that elevated their struggle beyond simple self-defense into something approaching a crusade for the values that made civilization worth preserving. As the night deepened and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Eli reflected on the journey that had brought him from the depths of personal failure to this moment of renewed purpose and possibility. The woman beside him represented not just the chance for love and partnership, but the opportunity to redeem his failures by completing the work that had cost her father his life. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I want you to know that meeting you has been the most important thing that's happened to me in years. You've reminded me why I became a lawman in the first place." Maybelle's response was to reach over and take his hand, her calloused fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that spoke of trust and affection that had survived every test their relationship had faced. In the warm pressure of her hand, Eli found the strength and determination that would carry him through whatever trials the morning would bring. The distant sound of horses approaching through the darkness brought their moment of peace to an abrupt end. Multiple riders were moving toward the ranch with the purposeful cadence that suggested either official business or hostile intent. Eli's hand moved instinctively to his weapon as he rose from his chair, every sense alert for signs of immediate danger. "Federal investigators don't travel at night," Maybelle observed, her voice tight with controlled tension. "And friends would have announced themselves by now." The approaching riders represented the confrontation they had been preparing for, but arriving 12 hours earlier than expected, and under circumstances that suggested violence rather than legal procedure. As Eli moved to rouse Tom and Annie from their positions within the house, he realized that Thornfield had decided to settle their dispute through methods that owed nothing to law and everything to the brutal pragmatism of men who had too much to lose to accept defeat gracefully. The battle for the Hart Ranch and for the truth about Thomas Hart's death was about to begin. The riders materialized out of the darkness like specters of violence, 6 men mounted on horses whose quality and condition spoke of serious money behind their mission. They approached the ranch house with the careful spacing and coordinated movement of professionals who had conducted such operations before, their weapons visible in the moonlight as deliberate statements of intent rather than tools of last resort. Eli recognized the tactical formation immediately, a frontal assault group supported by flanking elements designed to cut off escape routes and ensure that no witnesses survived to testify about what transpired. These were not local toughs hired for intimidation. They were skilled operatives brought in to eliminate a problem that had grown beyond the reach of legal maneuvering and political pressure. "Tom, get the documents to the root cellar," Eli called softly through the kitchen window as he took position behind the thick stone wall that formed the porch's western edge. "Annie, you're with Maybell in the house. Keep low and don't expose yourselves unless you have clear shots." The defensive positions they had prepared proved their worth as the attackers closed on the ranch house. The irrigation ditches that crisscrossed the property provided concealed movement for defenders while channeling the assault into predictable approaches that could be covered by intersecting fields of fire. The leader of the attacking force was a lean man whose bearing suggested military training and whose confidence spoke of successful completion of similar missions. He called out to the house with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his demands obeyed without question. Maybelle Hart, we know you're in there, and we know what you've been planning. Come out now, and this can be settled without unnecessary bloodshed. The offer was a lie. Eli knew. Men who approached in darkness with superior numbers and professional weapons had no intention of allowing their targets to survive regardless of cooperation or resistance. The demand for surrender was simply standard procedure designed to create hesitation and confusion that would make the assault more efficient. What do you want? Maybell called back, her voice carrying across the yard with deceptive calm that gave no hint of the zipped Winchester rifle she had positioned to cover the main approach to the house. You've been interfering with legitimate business interests, Miss Hart. That interference needs to stop permanently, along with your ability to cause further problems for your betters. The confirmation of lethal intent eliminated any possibility of negotiation or compromise. These men had been sent to ensure that Maybell's opposition to the land grab scheme died with her, and their presence meant that Thornfield had decided to resolve the situation through methods that left no room for legal complications or inconvenient survivors. Eli's first shot took the leader's center mass as the man raised his weapon toward the house, the heavy .45 slug spinning him from his saddle with the finality that came from excellent marksmanship and careful preparation. The sound of the Colt firing echoed across the valley like thunder, shattering the night quiet and announcing that the battle had begun in earnest. The attackers responded with professional competence, dismounting smoothly and taking cover behind water troughs and farm equipment, while returning fire that splintered wood and rang against stone with the distinctive whine of ricocheting bullets. Their coordination and discipline confirmed Eli's assessment that these were experienced killers rather than local hired guns. From her position in the house, Maybell's Winchester began speaking with the measured rhythm of someone who understood that ammunition was finite and every shot needed to count. Her targets were chosen with the calculating precision of someone who had learned to hunt game that could shoot back, and her accuracy was remarkable for someone supposedly without military training. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Eli called during a brief lull in the fighting as they reloaded their weapons and assessed the tactical situation. My father believed that women on the frontier needed to be prepared for situations that men couldn't always handle. Maybell replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline and danger of their circumstances. He hired a retired cavalry sergeant to teach me everything from basic marksmanship to advanced fieldcraft. The explanation added another layer to the mystery of Thomas Hart's preparation for the conflicts his financial activities might generate. Teaching his daughter military-level combat skills suggested that he had anticipated exactly the kind of violent resolution that was now playing out in his ranch yard. Tom Whitaker proved his own competence with firearms as he engaged targets from the barn loft, his positioning providing overlapping fields of fire that caught the attackers in a deadly crossfire when they attempted to advance on the house. His federal training showed in the way he conserved ammunition while maximizing the psychological impact of accurate shooting that kept their enemies pinned behind an adequate cover. The turning point came when Annie Caldwell demonstrated skills that no general store owner's daughter should have possessed. Moving through the irrigation ditches with the fluid grace of someone who had been trained in reconnaissance and infiltration, she approached the attackers' horses and methodically shot 3 of the animals to prevent escape while remaining completely undetected. Who taught her to move like that? Eli wondered aloud as Annie ghosted back toward the house through concealment that would have impressed professional scouts. Same person who taught me, Maybell replied grimly. My father believed in being thorough when it came to preparing for trouble. The implication that Thomas Hart had been training multiple people for exactly this kind of conflict suggested a level of anticipation that went beyond simple caution into something approaching military preparation. The banker who had died in Silver Creek had apparently been conducting his own private war against corruption long before his murder, brought federal attention to the scheme. As dawn approached and the surviving attackers found themselves trapped in an increasingly desperate situation, their leader made a final attempt to complete his mission through direct assault on the house. The man moved with the desperate courage of someone who understood that failure would result in consequences worse than death. But his advance was cut short by the combined fire of all four defenders, acting in perfect coordination. The sudden silence that followed the end of gunfire felt almost supernatural after hours of violence and tension. Smoke hung in the morning air like fog, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the ordinary ranch odors of hay and livestock to create an atmosphere that belonged neither to war nor peace, but to the strange aftermath of violent resolution. "Is it over?" Annie asked, her young voice carrying the exhaustion that followed extreme stress and danger. "For now," Eli replied, though his experience suggested that men like Thornfield rarely accepted defeat without making multiple attempts at revenge and retribution. As they emerged from their defensive positions to survey the aftermath of the battle, Eli found himself studying the woman who had fought beside him with such deadly competence. Maybelle Hart was clearly far more than a banker's daughter who had inherited financial responsibilities beyond her training. She was a product of careful preparation for exactly the kind of conflict they had just survived, and her capabilities suggested depths of character, an experience that he was only beginning to understand. The original deed to the Hart Ranch, retrieved from its hiding place during the battle, would serve as crucial evidence in the legal proceedings that would follow. But more than a simple property document, it represented the foundation of everything Thomas Hart had built and everything his daughter was determined to preserve regardless of the personal cost. The approaching sound of multiple horses announced the arrival of the federal investigators, 12 hours late, but precisely on schedule, according to town's arrangements. The timing would allow them to present their evidence while the bodies of Thornfield's assassins still lay in the ranch yard, as testimony to the lengths his associates were willing to go to prevent exposure of their crimes. Federal Marshal James Crawford and his team of investigators arrived at the Hart Ranch to find a scene that told its own story with brutal clarity. 6 bodies lay scattered across the ranch yard, their weapons and positioning confirming that this had been an attempted assassination rather than a random act of frontier violence. The evidence spoke with an eloquence that no legal brief could match about the desperation of men who had chosen murder over facing justice in a courtroom. "Deputy Marshal Brooks," Crawford said as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen enough violence to recognize its various motivations and methods. "Your telegram suggested we would find interesting developments here, but this exceeds even my expectations for territorial corruption cases." Eli's relationship with Crawford dated back 5 years to a complex investigation of railroad fraud in Colorado Territory, and the older man's presence represented not just federal authority, but the kind of experienced judgment that could distinguish between legitimate evidence and elaborate deception. Crawford's reputation for incorruptible integrity had made him the natural choice to investigate allegations against territorial officials who might have compromised other federal officers. "Marshal Crawford, this is Maybelle Hart, the woman whose banking activities have been the subject of recent allegations," Eli said, making the introduction with careful formality that acknowledged the gravity of their situation. "I believe you'll find that the reality of her situation differs significantly from the reports you've received." Crawford studied Maybelle with the appraising gaze of someone who had learned to read character through years of distinguishing between honest citizens and skilled criminals. What he saw apparently satisfied him, because his manner shifted from official suspicion to professional courtesy as he acknowledged her presence. "Miss Hart, I understand that serious charges have been made regarding your financial activities and their impact on territorial governance. Before we proceed with formal proceedings, Perhaps you could explain why 6 armed men felt it necessary to attack your ranch in the middle of the night. The question provided the opening that Tom Whitaker had been waiting for as he stepped forward, with the leather portfolio containing evidence that would transform the entire investigation. The documents he spread across the ranch house porch told a story of corruption so vast and well documented that it made Crawford's experienced features tighten with suppressed anger. "Marshal Crawford," Tom began, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had been building this case for months. "The men who attacked this ranch were sent by Marcus Thornfield and his associates to prevent Miss Hart from presenting evidence that would expose the largest corruption scheme in territorial history. The forged banking documents that Thornfield had planned to present as evidence of Maybell's criminal activities were revealed as fabrications when compared to the authentic records that Annie Caldwell had secretly copied during her intelligence work. The sophistication of the forgeries suggested resources and expertise that went far beyond anything a simple land grab would justify. "These men weren't trying to acquire property through legal means," Maybelle said, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had lost her father to the same criminal enterprise. "They were systematically looting territorial resources through fraudulent legal proceedings, while using federal authority to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose their operations." Crawford's examination of the evidence proceeded with the methodical thoroughness that had made him legendary among federal law enforcement officers. Each document was studied not just for its content, but for its provenance and corroboration through independent sources. The picture that emerged was of criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "The most damning evidence," Tom explained as he produced the correspondence between Thornfield and his Eastern associates, "shows that sitting territorial legislators have been selling their votes to railroad interests in exchange for shares in shell companies used to acquire land at fraudulent valuations." The letters revealed not just corruption, but treason in the form of territorial officials who had sold their authority to outside interests with no connection to or concern for the welfare of the people they supposedly represented. The scale of the betrayal made Crawford's jaw tighten with the kind of anger that came from seeing sacred trusts violated for personal gain. But it was the revelation of Thomas Hart's murder that transformed Crawford's investigation from a corruption case into something approaching a holy crusade for justice. The connection between Hart's death and his investigation of the land grab scheme provided the personal motivation that would drive Crawford to pursue this case regardless of political pressure or professional consequences. Thomas Hart was preparing to present evidence of this corruption scheme to federal authorities when he was killed. Eli explained, his voice heavy with the guilt he had carried for more than a year. "I was the investigating marshal, and I was forced off the case before I could complete the investigation that would have brought his killers to justice." Crawford nodded grimly, his experience with territorial politics providing immediate understanding of the pressures that could derail even well-intentioned investigations. The political connections these men possessed would have made a thorough investigation extremely difficult without ironclad evidence and unassailable witnesses. "Which is exactly what we're prepared to provide," Maybelle said, her voice carrying the resolve of someone who had found the strength to complete her father's work, regardless of personal cost. "My father spent 5 years documenting every aspect of their operations, and his records will prove that every allegation they've made against me is not only false, but deliberately fabricated to prevent exposure of their crimes." The presentation of evidence continued through the morning as Crawford's team photographed documents, interviewed witnesses, and reconstructed the sequence of events that had led to the previous night's violence. The professionalism and thoroughness of their investigation provided reassurance that this time, unlike with Thomas Hart's murder, the truth would not be buried under political pressure and bureaucratic expedients. Annie Caldwell's testimony proved particularly valuable as she described the systematic intelligence gathering that had allowed her to monitor Thornfield's operations from within his own organization. Her youth and apparent innocence made her the perfect operative for gathering information that more obvious investigators could never have accessed. The beauty of their scheme, Annie explained to Crawford, was that it used legitimate legal procedures to accomplish criminal objectives. Everything they did appeared to be proper railroad expansion and territorial development, until you looked at the financial flows and realized that the real beneficiaries were Eastern investors who had no intention of developing the land for public benefit. The investigation was interrupted by the arrival of additional federal officers, who brought news that transformed their local case into something with national implications. Thornfield and several of his key associates had been arrested in Helena, based on evidence that Crawford's team had telegrammed to federal authorities during the early morning hours. Marcus Thornfield is currently in federal custody, the lead officer announced, along with Territorial Banking Commissioner William Hartley and 2 sitting legislators who were caught attempting to destroy financial records that would have implicated them in the conspiracy. The news marked the beginning of the end for the corruption scheme that had cost Thomas Hart his life and threatened to destroy everything he had built to protect the people of Montana Territory. But more than simple justice, it represented validation of the principles that had guided both father and daughter in their opposition to greed and corruption, regardless of personal consequences. As the federal officers prepared to transport their evidence and witnesses to Helena for formal proceedings, Eli found himself facing a choice that would determine not just his professional future, but the nature of his relationship with Maybelle. Crawford had offered him full reinstatement as a federal marshal with the opportunity to see the case through to its final resolution in federal court. "I'll need time to consider your offer," Eli told Crawford, his eyes meeting Maybelle's across the ranch yard where she stood watching their conversation with the careful attention of someone whose own future hung in the balance. "Of course," Crawford replied, understanding passing between the 2 experienced lawmen about choices that involved more than professional considerations. "But don't take too long. This case is going to need officers who understand its full significance and who have the personal commitment to see it through, regardless of the political pressure we're likely to face." The telegram key that had allowed Maybelle to coordinate her financial empire throughout the crisis would now serve to spread news of their victory to banking consortium members across 3 counties. The network that Thomas Hart had built to protect honest citizens from predatory interests had proven stronger than the corruption that had tried to destroy it. As federal officers completed their investigation and prepared to depart with evidence that would reshape territorial politics, Eli realized that he and Maybelle had survived not just an assassination attempt, but a test of character that had revealed the true depth of their partnership and mutual commitment. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Montana Territory in shades of gold and crimson, Eli Brooks stood in the same spot where he had first glimpsed the Hart Ranch from the hillside trail. But everything had changed in ways that made that first desperate arrival feel like a memory from another man's life. The valley below still sprawled in the morning light, but now it carried the peaceful prosperity that came from justice. Served and corruption defeated, the federal trials had concluded, with convictions that sent shockwaves through territorial politics and reshaped the landscape of Western development. Marcus Thornfield and his principal associates were serving sentences that would keep them in federal prison for the remainder of their natural lives, while the forfeiture of their assets had provided restitution to the families they had destroyed through fraudulent land seizures. More importantly, for the long-term welfare of the territory, the exposure of the corruption scheme had led to fundamental reforms in territorial governance that made future conspiracies far more difficult to organize and sustain. The banking consortium that Thomas Hart had built continued under Maybelle's guidance, but now operated openly as a bulwark against the kind of predatory capitalism that had cost so many honest families their homes and livelihoods. The Hart Ranch itself bore visible signs of the changes that had swept through their lives. New buildings dotted the landscape, including a substantial addition to the main house that provided office space for Maybell's expanded role as the acknowledged leader of the regional banking network. But more significant than the physical improvements was the sense of openness and community that replaced the careful secrecy that had once characterized every aspect of ranch operations. The wooden sign that now marked the scene of entrance to the property read Hart and Brooks Ranch, in letters carved with the same careful craftsmanship that had characterized Thomas Hart's approach to everything he built. The partnership it announced was more than romantic or professional. It represented a merging of purposes and principles that had been tested by violence and validated by success. Eli's decision to decline Crawford's offer of federal reinstatement had surprised no one who understood the depth of his commitment to the woman who had transformed his understanding of what it meant to fight for justice. His experience as a federal marshal proved invaluable in his new role as the ranch's security chief and Maybell's partner in the complex business of managing financial networks that now operated under federal oversight and public scrutiny. "Sometimes I wonder what my father would think of all this," Maybelle said as she joined Eli on the hillside, where they often came to watch the sunset paint the valley in colors that changed with each passing day. "He built everything in secret, and here we are conducting the same business with newspaper reporters watching our every move." "He'd be proud," Eli replied without hesitation, his certainty based on months of studying Thomas Hart's carefully preserved records and correspondence. Everything he did was designed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The fact that we can now do the same work openly means he succeeded in ways he probably never dared to imagine. The vindication of Thomas Hart's vision extended beyond simple business success to encompass the transformation of an entire region's approach to economic development. The principles he had embedded in the banking consortium transparency, community benefit, and protection of individual property rights had become the model for territorial banking reform throughout the Western Territories. Annie Caldwell's role in exposing the corruption scheme had earned her recognition that went far beyond her age and supposed experience. Her intelligence work had caught the attention of federal authorities who had offered her positions that would utilize her remarkable skills in service of law enforcement and territorial security. But like Eli, she had chosen to remain in Sagebrush Falls, where her father's general store had become the unofficial headquarters for a network of information gathering that helped prevent the kind of corruption that had once threatened to destroy their community. The romance that had developed between Eli and Maybelle during their shared struggle against overwhelming odds had evolved into something deeper and more complex than simple attraction or mutual dependence. Their partnership encompassed not just personal affection, but shared purpose and complementary skills that made them far more effective together than either could be alone. "I've been thinking about expanding the banking consortium's operations into Colorado territory," Maybelle said as they watched cattle moving across the pastures below in the leisurely way of animals that knew they were safe and well cared for. "There are reports of the same kind of corruption schemes that we fought here, and the people there deserve the same protection my father tried to provide in Montana." The proposal represented both opportunity and challenge, requiring them to extend their influence into territory where they lacked the network of allies and information sources that had proven crucial to their success in Montana. But it also offered the chance to honor Thomas Hart's memory by protecting other communities from the kind of predatory schemes that had cost him his life. "We'd need federal support," Eli observed, his law enforcement experience providing perspective on the political and logistical challenges such expansion would entail. "And we'd be making new enemies among people who have even more to lose than Thornfield's group did." "True," Maybelle agreed, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that doing what was right mattered more than doing what was safe. "But we'd also be giving hope to people who have none, and protection to families who need it. That seems like work worth doing, regardless of the personal risks. The conversation embodied the evolution of their relationship from desperate alliance against immediate threat to partnership in a larger vision of what Western development could become when guided by principle rather than greed. The love that had grown between them was inseparable from their shared commitment to continuing the work that Thomas Hart had begun. As evening settled over the valley and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Eli reflected on the journey that had brought him from the depths of personal failure to this moment of renewed purpose and deep contentment. The woman beside him represented not just the love he had thought he would never find, but the opportunity to build something lasting and meaningful in a world that too often rewarded expedience over integrity. The pocket watch that Maybell still carried bore her father's inscription about using power wisely and wearing it lightly, advice that had guided her through the most dangerous period of her life and would continue to shape her approach to the responsibilities that came with wealth and influence. But she no longer carried that burden alone. The Hart and Brooks Ranch stood as testament to the possibility of partnership between equals who shared not just affection but purpose, not just attraction, but vision for a future that honored the past, while embracing the challenges of continued growth and development. In the warm intimacy of shared silence, watching their valley settle into the peaceful rhythms of evening, Eli and Maybell found the contentment that came from work well done and love freely given. The dust cloud that had once marked Eli's desperate arrival as a broken man seeking only employment and shelter had long since settled, replaced by the solid foundation of a life built on truth, partnership, and commitment to principles that transcended personal advantage. Sometimes, as Thomas Hart had understood and his daughter had proven, the greatest fortunes were indeed found in the simplest places, by those wise enough to recognize that true wealth was measured not in acres owned, but in lives lifted and communities protected. In the gathering darkness, the lights of Sagebrush Falls twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing families and dreams that were safer, because two people had chosen to stand together against corruption and greed. The poor cowboy and the secret banking heiress had become something greater than the sum of their individual parts, partners in every sense of the word, building a legacy that honored the dead while protecting the living. The frontier had always been a place where people could reinvent themselves, where past failures could be redeemed through present courage, and where love could flourish in the most unlikely circumstances. The Hart and Brooks Ranch embodied all of these possibilities, standing as proof that sometimes the most important victories were won not through individual heroism, but through the simple recognition that the strongest foundations were built on trust, partnership, and shared commitment to something greater than oneself.